distinguished lecture series with John Andelson, Courting Sustainability at Las Gaviotas, Anti-Structure and Triple Bottom Line. And I'd like to, I won't say much about Gaviotas, I'll let John say all that, but I wanted to say a few words about John. John is the director of the Center for Prairie Studies at Grinnell College. And Prairie Studies is widely defined to include the human ecology of the prairie and energy and food. And it's really the place where sustainability initiatives kind of gravitate around in Grinnell College and in the community. He's developed something called the Grinnell Area Local Food Alliance, GALFA, and something called the Grinnell Area Petroleum Replacement Initiative, GAPRI. He's very good at acronyms. And there's many people who grew up in the Fairfield community have gone to Grinnell. One of them's here, Avi Pogel, who's become a leader here in our sustainability initiatives. So the next generation comes on. And I'd also like to appreciate John because he's really responsible for me having a teaching career. I don't know how, do you know how your kind words to me have been at certain times in my life? Thank you. And he supported me in my summer program and in giving me some teaching positions at Grinnell College, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you. So we're working to have more broader collaborations between Grinnell students and MUM students and faculty at Grinnell and other progressive colleges around the region. So we've got something called the, what's the acronym there, John? It's the Iowa Colleges Sustainability Initiative, ICSI. And so we're still working on that one. And so without further ado, and John has, his wife is from Colombia, and he's had the good opportunity to spend some time with Paolo Lugari, the developer of Gaviotas Eco Village, and he's going to talk to us tonight. So let's give him a warm Fairfield welcome.
Good morning, and thanks for being here tonight. But you know, despite the kind words that Lonnie used to introduce me, the truth is that I feel a little bit like an imposter coming to Fairfield to talk about sustainability, because from where I sit in Grinnell, whenever the word sustainability comes up, I think of Fairfield and MUM and Lonnie Gamble and the Sustainable Living Coalition. So you folks are way ahead of the curve and trendsetters, so keep it up. You're doing a fabulous job. Wanted to start with just a quick review of some of the big problems that we all know about, just to set the stage for what I see happening at Gaviotas. This is good? Yeah, okay. One of those big issues, of course, is human population growth. We're at the tip of the blue line there now, just past 7 billion last year, was it? Nobody's quite sure where it will go from here. 3 options there: pessimistic, optimistic, and desperate. If you take a look at the population growth on a longer time frame, the last 10,000 years, this is how it looks. It represents an almost unbelievable uptick in that population line. We were doing pretty well as just one part of the global ecosystem. Too loud?
No.
No. Okay. We were doing pretty well as just one part of the global ecosystem for about 6,000 years, and then about 2,000 years ago we began to lose the balance, and you can see where it is today. You've all heard about the extinctions of the past. There have been 5 great periods of extinction in the Earth's history. The most dramatic one was at the end of the Permian, when almost half of the biological families of organisms became extinct. You can see the other 4 there that were lesser but still pretty dramatic. And coming back to today and to the human population growth, you can see in this graph the correlation between the recent human population growth and the incredibly steep ascent of extinctions. To so much so that Elizabeth Colbert, as you probably know, has published a book called The Sixth Great Extinction. So we are currently in the midst of it. I got very depressed looking at this slide. Soil degradation around the world. As you can see, I actually have a pointer right there, and we're in the middle of one of the areas of serious concern. Soil is the foundation. If we lose the soil, we really will be stuck. As you probably know, Iowa has lost half its topsoil in the last 150 years. It's a result of European-style farming. We also all know about the distribution of wealth in the world. I have to resort to glasses here to read the fine print. About 69% of the world's population controls about 3% of the wealth. On the other hand, 0.7% of the world's population controls 41% of the wealth. And a little over 8.5% of the world's population controls 82% of the wealth. If you've not gone onto the internet to see the Gini coefficient, Gini, I encourage you to do so and see what's happening to the Gini coefficient in different countries around the world. In some countries, it's getting better. In some, it's not too bad. In others, it's getting worse, and we are, in the United States, in one of the countries that's doing a little worse. The Hopi would, in thinking about all of these serious issues, perhaps invoke their word koyaanisqatsi, life out of balance. How many of you have seen the film Koyaanisqatsi? Great. Those of you who haven't, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the film. It's a riveting, fascinating, and ultimately disturbing film. The Hopi ideal, a life in balance. And I think that's what we are all hoping to strive for here. Balance produces adaptability, resiliency, sustainable development, and persistence. The first use of the term sustainable development that I've been able to track down was 1972 classic book, The Limits to Growth. It was used but not defined. Generally, there's consensus that the first definition that made much of a splash of the term sustainable development came out of the Brundtland Report, 1987. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Put it more succinctly, sustainability is the capacity to endure. One scholar put it, enough for all forever. Aristotle might simply have said eudaimonia, human flourishing, as well as the flourishing of the larger global ecosystem. I'm sure you've heard people talk about the triple bottom line of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social. Some people like to call social equity sustainability, simply so they can talk about the 3 E's. Here's one way of conceptualizing their relationship. That's the sweet spot. That's where you can achieve all 3 forms of sustainability, certainly our goal. A different view of the triple bottom line, this one more like a bullseye. And something happened to my slide there in translation, I'm not sure. In the center should be economic sustainability. It is surrounded by the larger social context, society, and it in turn is surrounded by the larger environmental context. So 2 different ways to picture sustainability, and there are others. Those are probably the 2 most common. Very briefly, let's review what each of those suggests, starting with environmental sustainability. Here we want to maintain natural capital, including both source capacities and sink capacities. Source capacity is the environment's ability to continue to provide resources that we need. Sink capacity is the environment's ability to absorb, to assimilate the outputs and wastes of our activities. Another part of environmental sustainability would be protecting biodiversity, and a very important part is ensuring knowledge and appreciation of nature. Economic sustainability involves maintaining physical capital, tools, machines, means of transportation, all of the things that are used to produce and move goods and services. Also, as any business owner will tell you, income has to exceed expenses for the business to be economically sustainable. There has to be employment. That's a crucial feature of sustainability, good jobs for those who want work. Then I've added a couple of other points. One is caution about the idea of substitutability. Economists, mainstream economists, really like the idea of substitutability. You begin to run out of one resource, the price gets higher, you find a substitute for it. We began to run out of wood in England in the 17th century, and they found an alternative for coal, an alternative for wood in coal. Sustainability scholars have serious reservations about this idea of substitutability. To sustainability scholars, it tends to suggest problems rather than solutions, the way the economists tend to think of it. And finally, caution about the idea of growth. Mainstream economists, again, tend to advocate growth. The economy will only be successful if it's growing. And they have all kinds of measures of growth, GDP, GNP, the employment rate, and so on. Sustainability scholars, on the other hand, are more suspicious of growth. It is perhaps one of the things, in their view, that is causing the problems in the world, causing the lack of sustainability, causing koyaanisqatsi. Finally, social or equity sustainability. Here we want to maintain human capital, the stock of education and skills, culture, knowledge, arts, that is part of the human condition and the human product of our amazing and wonderfully fertile minds. Social sustainability also suggests population continuity and stability. If you're in a situation like so many small towns in Iowa in which the population is falling, there's something not sustainable about those small towns. And we've seen many of them slide into virtual third world country status right here in Iowa. So we want population to be stable, we want population to persist, and maybe slight growth. Sustainability scholars aren't too keen on rapidly growing population. We also want social equity, both intergenerational and intragenerational. We desperately have to have an absence of corruption, crime, and war. Those factors make achieving sustainability almost impossible. And finally, well-being or happiness, a big part of what most scholars think of when they talk about social sustainability. How can sustainability be achieved? A lot of people advocate market solutions, cap and trade, things like that. The market will solve the problems and we will be able to use the market to achieve sustainability. I wonder how many of you have actually seen Adam Smith's original words. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was not part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Adam Smith, neoliberal economic theory. That's where it comes from, that idea of the invisible hand. More recently, a scholar critical of neoliberal economic theory has referred to the invisible foot, which stomps on people, stomps on the environment as a result of everybody pursuing their own individual self-interest. So market solutions is one possible way to go, in order to identify and claim sustainability. Another place that a lot of people turn to is government policy and government regulations to help us try to achieve sustainability. That one got moved around too, my apologies. Here's a list of major environmental legislation starting in 1960 with the Air Quality Act, going up to 1996, Safe Drinking Water Act amendments. You'll notice there isn't anything on this chart after 1996. We really haven't had much effective, worth mentioning environmental legislation. And needless to say, the federal government today seems pretty well locked into inaction and incapacity. Nevertheless, many people are hoping that the government will be the ones leading the way to sustainability. The third way to move us towards sustainability would be through NGOs, grassroots organizations, and community-based solutions. Just a couple of examples on the slide. The Sierra Club, one of the oldest efforts in that direction, the Iowa Environmental Council, grassroots protesters, the villages of Crest Mountain, a sustainable community trying to achieve sustainability in North Carolina. This is where my talk focuses on NGO, grassroots, and community-based solutions. I am not particularly optimistic about the first two, about market solutions or government solutions, at least at this point. So I'm putting my hopes into this third area, which will involve three more E's: ethics, education, and empowerment, and a C, consciousness. Which brings me to my example for this evening, the Gaviotas community in Colombia. You can see its location. It's in the vast grasslands to the east of the Colombian Andes. You can see a couple of actually there are three different mountain range chains of the Andes here, and the area to the east is known as the Llanos. And the arrow indicates the location of Gaviotas. The Llanos basically means a savanna. It's a very extensive grassland. It's a little bit bigger than Texas. A very impressive part of the country, but to people who live in the mountains, it's a little bleak, a little forbidding. It's got a very pronounced rainy season and dry season. The rainy season lasts from April to October, and the dry season is the rest of the year. But during that rainy season, they get about 100 inches of rain each year. Knowing that I'm in Fairfield, I'm pretty confident that a lot of you know how many inches of rain we get here. Who can tell me? 35, 37 inches of rain, yeah. So the Llanos, although it's got a very pronounced dry season, gets almost 3 times as much rain as Iowa. During the dry season, very strong winds blow out of the Andes. The soils are relatively poor. Significant reduction of biodiversity recently as agriculture has spread into the Llanos. It's one of the last agricultural frontiers in the world. There's still room for more expansion of agriculture, but both cattle and cash cropping are causing the same kinds of problems that agriculture has caused in Iowa in terms of biodiversity reduction. Fairly recently, petroleum exploration has begun there, which is causing the kinds of problems that you can imagine. The Llanos has also been an area of guerrilla activity in Colombia. It's subsided a little bit in the last 10 years or so, but it's still there. Colombia went through a terribly difficult time politically in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. FARC and other guerrilla groups were pretty much running parts of the country. My wife, as Lonnie said, was born in Colombia, but when she was 12 years old, her father farmed out in the Llanos. But when she was 12 years old, he came home one day and said, "We're leaving." And the reason was that the children of landowners in Colombia, in the Llanos in particular, were very subject to kidnapping and being held for ransom. So family moved to Costa Rica and he began farming there, a different kind of farming, a different environment. And also going along with the guerrilla activity has been narco-trafficking, the drug trade, of course, being a big part of the Colombian economy. And there's the man himself, the founder of Gaviotas. I had the opportunity when we took a family vacation to Colombia a couple of years ago to visit Gaviotas, and I grabbed it. I'd been hearing about the place for, well, at that point, about 14 years, ever since Alan Weissman published a book called Gaviotas, A Village to Reinvent the World, excuse me. And I had actually taught that book in a class, and then one day my wife saw me reading the book, and she said, "Oh, Gaviotas, my father knows Lugari." So I said, "Really? Great, okay." So then a couple years after that, we decided to take a trip to Colombia to celebrate her 50th birthday, and she wanted to visit the Llanos where she had grown up, and I said, "Hey, how about throwing in a little side trip to Gaviotas?" And she was all for that. So we got to go there. There may be somebody in the audience who's spent more time in Gaviotas than I actually have. I was there, but only for a day, and then we had Lugari, in fact, at our disposal for that entire day, and I interviewed him for about 14 hours in between lunch and seeing things. And then we met him again later that same week in Bogota and continued the interview. So that's the basis for what I have to say tonight about Gaviotas. I have not stayed there long. In fact, he said we should not stay overnight. It was too dangerous because of the guerrilla activity that still exists in the area. The way he put it actually was, and my wife is the daughter of German immigrants, he said, "Looking the way you do, it wouldn't be safe." I'm not going to go through Paolo Lugari's entire biography. You can read about it in Alan Weissman's book, Gaviotas. Let me turn instead to his critique of conventional economic development in the third world. For one thing, he said it creates too much wealth and too much poverty. Conventional economic development tends to create an enriched class or enrich an already wealthy class. And at the same time, it creates poverty. You might want to say that it's relative poverty relative to the increasingly wealthy part of the population, but that still counts as poverty, as anybody who's familiar with third world urban growth can attest. He said it promotes excessively materialistic values, and this isn't good for us as a species. It's not good for the future. Fosters too rapid population growth, propels hyper-urbanization. As you probably know, Bogota has over 10 million people now, the vast majority of whom live in very, very poor conditions. And Lugari was familiar, certainly firsthand, with that. He considers cities also to be very inefficient ways of organizing human society and prone to crime. Conventional economic theory relies on agriculture, but agriculture done in the industrial mode. High chemical use, high fossil fuel input, large machinery, getting rid of labor where it's possible to displace labor with machines, and generally polluting the world. Creates too much environmental destruction, and all of these problems, he feels, are worse in the third world. So Lugari's goals for Gaviotas, which he began in the early 1970s, this is a direct quote, was to create a sustainable community in the third world tropics using principles and techniques appropriate to the third world. The environmentalist Paul Hawken visited Gaviotas, I think about 8 or 10 years ago now, and his summary assessment of the place was, after looking around at the Llanos, seeing all of the challenges, all of the problems, Paul Hawken said, if it can be done here, it can be done anywhere. And that was his assessment. So, as I said, we took advantage of an opportunity to visit. We chartered a little plane. Gaviotas has its own landing strip because that's how people get back and forth to Bogota. Flying over the area, we could see the sluggish Llaneran rivers. This is the River Meta. Very wide. You can see all the sandbanks clearly. This is during the dry season. During the rainy season, that would be completely full and overflowing its banks. In fact, we couldn't have visited Gaviotas in the rainy season. It would have been impossible to get there. We also flew over industrial-style agriculture in the Llanos, as I mentioned. Las Gaviotas means the Gulls. This is the logo that they have created for themselves. Orinoquia refers to the general Orinoco watershed. You've probably heard of the Orinoco River. Just a few pictures of the setting in Gaviotas. We'll come back into this building in a minute. Walking around the community, ordinary homes, some interesting, unusual buildings. That one was a solar collector on the roof. School. And let me also mention that there is a facility in Bogota that Gaviotas owns also. Lugari has an office there, but he spends about half his time nowadays in Gaviotas and the other half of his time in Bogota. Well, I told you how long I was with him. He loved to talk. And as a good anthropologist, I love to listen, and I did a lot of listening. And my Spanish is más o menos, but my wife's Spanish is flawless, of course, and so she filled in whenever I didn't quite get it. So what I want to address this evening is the question, how well is Gaviotas doing 40 years out in Lugari's goal of achieving sustainability? And I'm going to break it down into the triple bottom line of sustainability: economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability, in that order. I asked Lugari, because it wasn't quite clear from Weissman's book how the community was organized economically, and somewhat to my surprise, he said, well, it's organized as a nonprofit foundation, and that explains a lot about Gaviotas. However, unlike a lot of nonprofit foundations, it accepts no grants or donations. I found that out when, at the end of the day, I said, gee, this is really great and impressive. I'd like to make a donation to the Gaviotas effort. And he said, we don't accept donations. I was amazed at that. So how do they keep this whole thing going? How have they kept it going for 40 years with no donations? He did correct it. He said, well, right at the beginning, we got a grant from the United Nations to help start up. But if if we were talking about the entire budget being $100 or 100 pesos, he said the United Nations grant represented 1 peso. So it was really small. It did help, but it wasn't the main driver of our beginnings. But since then, they have not been accepting any donations or grants. Nevertheless, they pay all of the people who live there and work there, pay them very decent salaries. Lugari's impression was that they're the best salaries in rural Colombia next to the petrochemical industry. Well, and probably next to the narco-trafficking effort. So, how does Gaviotas survive economically? One of its earliest industries was photovoltaics. They built themselves a factory and started manufacturing photovoltaic arrays that initially were used for solar water heaters. Some of the slides are pictures that I took during the visit. Some are pictures that Paolo Lugari provided us as part of a talk he had given, and that's why they're numbered. You'll see that sometimes the English isn't quite right. So all of the water that used at Gaviotas, the hot water used at Gaviotas, was heated by their photovoltaics, and this goes back to the early mid-1970s. They also sold solar heating panels in various cities in Colombia. This one in Medellin, a neighborhood housing development. You can see all of the homes there have photovoltaic panels manufactured in Gaviotas. I think Cali has one, and many of the government buildings in Bogota have photovoltaics manufactured in Gaviotas. Another early project was planting Caribbean pines. These pines are not native to that area. I'll say a little more about that fact later. But here's early on some of the Gavioteros planting these pine seedlings and thinning them and harvesting seedlings for transplant. In other places, a lot of back-breaking labor, but eventually they were able to afford more mechanized ways of planting these trees. And it's resulted in a pine plantation. They have now planted 8,000 hectares of Caribbean pine, whose rosin they tap. Of course, it's a renewable resource. And the rosin is processed in this facility at Gaviotas, which we saw in operation. And hot rosin is loaded into these cardboard boxes using recycled cardboard. And it's shipped to Bogota, where it's used in the paint industry, an important component of paints. Another product from the pines is pine oil, used for a variety of purposes as a lubricant, cleaning product, disinfectant, massage oil, and in cosmetics and aromatherapy, pine oil. They get turpentine. They manufacture turpentine as part of this whole process, and that also is sold nationally. So, for starters, I'm going to add more to this in a little bit. Gaviotas' sustainable economy comes from the manufacture of photovoltaic panels, turpentine, pine rosin, pine oil. Also, Lugari's speaking fees. He's slowed down a little bit lately, but he used to travel around a lot and give talks and command a speaking fee of about $1,000, and all of his speaking fees went also to the foundation, nonprofit foundation. In addition to the income, they try very hard to control their costs through common property, simple living, energy, and food self-sufficiency. A lot of the same things are going on here in Fairfield, I know. Gaviotas is doing them too. plus a very strong work ethic. The only requirement, Lugari told me, to live at Gaviotas is that there has to be work for you to do. He said that they tried in the beginning to make it possible for some people to come and just hang out. For some people to come, and I don't want to disparage any musicians in the audience, some people to come and just make music and not do any of the work in the more materially productive areas. But he said that didn't fly. It didn't work out. Everybody has to work, and work is a central value in Gaviotas. He said, we're a community of work. I work all the time. I get tired if I rest. Some of the spacing on my slides got disturbed by one of these transmissions. So that's what I wanted to say about economic sustainability. Let's turn to social sustainability. There are a lot of indicators, you remember from that slide, a lot of indicators of social sustainability. But the bottom line is simply that the social system operates in a way that can continue. And this means not alienating people who are in it, not doing things that cause people to leave. One of my main areas of interest has been the history of the Amana community. And one of the big problems that Amana faced, although when they started out, they were sustainable economically, environmentally, and socially, they lost their social sustainability. And beginning around the turn of the 20th century, more and more people from the Amanas decided they were dissatisfied and left. And it was especially the young people, and this caused a real crunch in the community in terms of work. So you can't let that happen. You have to hold on to people. You have to keep them there. I mentioned population continuity and stability. In Gaviotas, there are about 200 people today. There are living in the community. Some workers and many friends of the community, as they're semi-formally referred to, live in the vicinity. Population actually has been larger. It was probably as big as 500 or 600 in the 1970s. And then the political troubles began in Colombia, and some people just got too frightened and left, and the population has not recovered, but it hasn't gotten any worse in the last 10 years. According to Paolo, most of the people there have been there for 30 years or more. I didn't have an independent way to confirm this, so I offer that as just a claim that he made. There are no officers and no rules in Gaviotas. It's a very non-hierarchical system. Paolo said, well, it was kind of natural for me to think of him as the leader of the community. He said, no, I'm not the leader. I only have one voice like every other member. And in 40 years, I have never called a meeting. In 40 years, I have never written an internal memo. How does it work? It works by people staying after lunch and talking. Staying after dinner and talking. And as he described it to me, there's some issue, people want to talk about it. Somebody comes up with an idea, somebody else has another idea, he jumps in with an idea, somebody else has an idea, and together, collectively, through conversation, they take the steps. They plan things. They plan what to plant. They plan what industries to create and start. They plan what to do with the rosin from the pine trees. They plan what homes to build. It's all done through conversation and consensual decision making. The only records that they keep, he told me, are economic records, because you have to keep those. You have to be able to figure out how you're doing economically. And furthermore, he stressed, they not only have to be honest, but they have to appear to be honest, as well. Very important for him. So Gaviotas is more than a village, more than a community. It is an organism governed by conversation. That quote he made right at the beginning of our interview, I said, Alan Weissman considers Gaviotas a village, but isn't it more than a village? Isn't it really a community? And he said, it's more than a village and more than a community. Neither of those words is adequate to capture what Gaviotas is. I said, well, if it's not a village or a community, what is it? He said it's an organism. Or if you prefer, it's an ecosystem. So he was thinking outside of traditional categories, and I'm going to come back to that point. I think it's significant. Egalitarianism is a very central value in Gaviotas. Among the earliest settlers there, the earliest people who lived in Gaviotas, there were a number of engineers. There were also some artists, also some musicians, also some teachers, also some farmers. But he said, we are all scientists. Some people have a degree after their name and others don't. Here that doesn't matter. Here what matters is your mind and the creative use of your mind. We all participate in the conversations as equals. I have diplomas on my wall. They don't make any difference at all in Gaviotas. That's not what we're about. At one point I had occasion to ask him about the Guahibo, the local indigenous tribe that lives right around Gaviotas. And he said, why do you single them out? Why should we count them separately? For him, they were simply people. Everybody's the same. Everybody is equal. No distinctions are made. This extends to religion. He said all faiths, including atheists, are welcome here. And in fact, we have a lot of people people represent a lot of different religions here. They had Buddhists, Hindus, Catholics, Mormons, atheists, Jews, Christian scientists. He said, the more the better. And people ask me, this is a quote, people ask me, what are you? And I say, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Hindu, I'm whatever you want me to be. I said, well, are there religious services at Gaviotas? And he said, anyone who comes here as a spokesperson for a religion, we will put them up free of charge, feed them free of charge for a reasonable period of time, and let them preach their religion. And the room that we were sitting in when he made this comment was the cafeteria. And he said, this is where they can do it. We don't have a religious building of any kind. Gaviotas once operated a boarding school in the first 15, 20 years that the community was in existence. But this too had to go when the political troubles began. A lot of the people who sent their children to Gaviotas to attend the boarding school lived in Bogota or Medellin or Villavicencio, and when the political troubles began, they thought it was too dangerous for their children to stay. So they pulled the children out of school, and that caused the school required them to close the school. Today, the children of all the people who live there receive homeschooling from their parents in the conventional subjects. And then they also do a series of apprenticeships in the various economic units in Gaviotas. Food production or engineering or whatever it is, as a kind of rotation. And they learn a lot of other things through those experiences. The children then often, not all of them, but many of them leave to get high school education or even college education. Paolo said that many of them return after they finish their education to the community to get involved again. And I see the same kind of thing elements of that at least happening here in Fairfield. Another aspect of social sustainability that was apparent to me from the time I spent there was the incorporation of art into the community. Art is everywhere in Gaviotas. This isn't a sloth, a real sloth. It's a carved wooden sloth. My daughter's standing next to. There are these little carvings all over the place, made by different people. Big mural in the common room, the cafeteria room. And since I mentioned the cafeteria, here were some of the members who served us lunch when we were there. Food and the idea of eating together is another central value in Gaviotas. And here I am. I don't know if you can tell that those are my daughters, but the three daughters. My wife took the picture, and Paolo, of course, on the right. Okay, that's what I have to say about the social sustainability. Environmental sustainability. Here's a reminder of the things that we're talking about: source capacities, sink capacities, biodiversity, and ultimately a carbon footprint. Gaviotas generates its own electricity. Low-fall hydroelectric generation. It was very significant, I think, for the community's beginning that there were a number of engineers among the earliest settlers, the earliest members, and they really went to work on all kinds of things, including developing a turbine that would generate electricity with a very low fall of water, a fall of about a foot or 18 inches. They developed a special turbine that would allow electric generation from such a low fall. The engineers were thinking outside the box. They came up with all kinds of what we might consider alternative or appropriate technology, and were creating amazing innovations in Gaviotas. And they're still there, many of them, and still doing it. You turned the wheel and lit the electric light bulbs just to prove that it was working. And this was the guy who was explaining it all to us. His Spanish was really fast, and I couldn't understand him at all. Another source of energy comes from African oil palms that the community has planted. This does look a little like industrial agriculture. It's done on a very big scale. They manufacture biodiesel fuel from the African oil palm. I'm sure you know that African oil palm is one of the major crops, non-food crops in the world today, particularly in the tropics. There are a lot of environmental problems associated with it, but at least in Gaviotas, they're putting it to an appropriate kind of use. Their automobiles and tractors are powered entirely by biodiesel fuel that they are manufacturing themselves. Gaviotas also harnesses wind energy. I mentioned the wind during the dry season. It required a special kind of wind turbine which their engineers developed that could stand up to the very strong winds in the dry season but still function in the rainy season with much weaker winds. So biodiesel, wind, photovoltaics, energy, and hydroelectric, there we go. They manufacture these wind turbines themselves, low-cost manual equipment. And they also sell the wind turbines, so that's another source of income for the community. So 100% of their energy comes from renewable sources. Water, potable water is a big issue in the Llanos, especially during the dry season. The water table falls pretty significantly. Trying to get to that water in an energetically efficient way had been a real stumbling block, and clean water was a serious health issue. The lack of clean water was a serious health issue. Again, the Gaviotas engineers went to work, designed a special kind of sleeve pump that could pump water from way down in the ground with minimal effort, minimal energy expended. You can do it, work it by hand. I think almost everybody's favorite story about Gaviotas is that the children using teeter-totters operated these pumps to bring the water up. Great use of the high energy level of little kids. The wind turbines have also been used to draw up water. Water has become a central motif in Gaviotas. The lack of water for part of the year, the dramatic lack of water for part of the year, is undoubtedly part of the reason for that. And they have created a water bottling facility. The building itself actually once was a clinic that the community operated, both for its own members and for the neighboring people. But the government shut it down because it didn't comply with certain mandated health requirements and regulations that the Colombian government had. So what they did was convert the clinic into this water bottling plant. And they provide free bottled water to all of the locals, both residents of the community and the people around. And they then sell other bottled water to Bogota, another source of income for them. Among the recipients of the water are the Guahibo, and it has completely eliminated dysentery among them. Dysentery had been a crippling health issue for the Guahibo. The empty water bottles are recycled and turned into walls of houses. They have organic biodynamic gardens, papaya, yucca, banana, pineapple. Neither my wife nor I could remember what he said they were going to plant in these beds, but something edible. They raise chickens, they eat eggs, the meat. They raise ducks and geese, again, eat the eggs and the meat. They have large fish ponds. When we were visiting, this one was drained for cleaning, and they stock the ponds with fish, and that's a very important part of their diet too. They're currently producing about 60% of the food that they eat. Paolo said that he hopes that they can get up to 80 to 90% of all the food. Biodiversity. Gaviotas has actually enriched the biodiversity of the area, and they've done this in a very unexpected, unplanned, and fascinating way. They planted 8,000 hectares of Caribbean pine. That's a lot of trees. It's enough trees to change the microclimate underneath the pines. And they didn't expect it, but after a few years after they began planting these pine stands, underneath began to develop a whole another ecosystem of native plants that existed in the soil bank but weren't growing because of the exposure to the sun. The biodiversity has consequently, of the Gaviotas area, has consequently increased tremendously. Not only plants, but insects, bird life, other life forms. So their effort, and I forgot to mention that these Caribbean pines don't reproduce themselves in the Llanos. They are an exotic species from the Caribbean area. They grow fine, but they don't reproduce themselves, so they don't have any weedy potential. And in time, those pines will die, and then presumably we will have this native plant ecosystem thriving in the Llanos.
Does it include the native trees or just smaller plants?
No, like this one here that you can see. That's a native species. It didn't quite make sense to me. Paolo said that his guess was that part of the Llanos once was part of the Amazon, Orinoco rainforest. and that things had happened to eliminate it, but the seeds were still in the seed bank. That was his guess. I don't know that a biologist has pronounced on it.
The birds and other animals will carry the seeds in their intestines and wind up make an environment that the wildlife is comfortable with. You'll get stuff.
You'll get other stuff coming in, absolutely, sure. Good point. That 8,000 hectares, that's about 20,000 acres. 1 hectare of trees captures about 20 tons of CO2, and that more than offsets the carbon that the Gaviotans release through their daily activities. And this has been scientifically demonstrated. Gaviotas is thus not only carbon neutral, but carbon positive. And that assessment didn't even include all that new growth under the Caribbean pine canopy. So this is how it looks to me. Next slide. Same thing happened to this one. On the top line, there should be environmental and a check mark by it, and then a check mark by social sustainability and economic sustainability too. It seems to me that we can say that Gaviotas has achieved the triple bottom line of sustainability. What explains it? Just in the last part of my remarks tonight, I want to offer a hypothesis for your consideration about how we can account for their success in this effort that's only 40 years old. It's not big, only 200 people at this point, but pretty impressive what they have accomplished, and impressive that they are carbon positive. I want to rely on the work of the anthropologist Victor Turner, who described 2 modes of human social interaction. One mode he called structure, and the other mode he called anti-structure. In the structure mode, people relate to one another in terms of rules, roles, statuses, positions within an institution. Structure classifies people. It organizes people. It assigns tasks. It provides consistency and predictability. It gets things done in a conventional way. In structure, the mode of structure, relationships are largely formal, instrumental. People enter into relationships in order to accomplish something, in order to get some task done. At least that's the usual way we think of structure. Relationships are generally contractual in some sense, and they're often, if not nearly always, hierarchical. If you're familiar with the work of Martin Buber, Victor Turner likened this mode of interaction to what Martin Buber labeled as an I-it type of relationship. On the other hand, anti-structure. People set aside their roles in anti-structure, set aside their statuses, and they relate to one another as equals in a mode that Turner also calls communitas. In communitas, he says, people's authentic selves meet and mingle, and relationships are spontaneous and familial. If you think of the relationships within a family, at least within some families, of course there may be roles and statuses, but there's something more spontaneous, more egalitarian about relationships within a family than there are about relationships, for example, in most businesses. Turner likened this mode of interaction to what Martin Buber called an I-thou kind of relationship. I-it, instrumental, structured, contractual, typically hierarchical. I-thou, more egalitarian, more coming together as equals and as one. Coming away from my visit to Gaviotas, it began to occur to me that an awful lot of what I saw there was similar to Victor Turner's notion of anti-structure. Paolo rejected all kinds of classifications. He rejected the label village. He rejected the label community. He rejected it when I tried to classify the Guahibo as something separate. Got into one little conversation with him. I said, so the people who live at Gaviotas are members? He said, no, they're not members. Foundations don't have members. They're not like communities or clubs. I said, oh, okay, so are they stockholders? He said, no, that word doesn't work either. I said, well, they're employees, right? He said, no, we don't use that word here. And I was getting a little desperate, and I said with a little edge on my voice, I think, well, what do you call the people here? And he laughed. He said, they're gavioteros, people from Gaviotas. That's all he needed. So he rejected standard classifications. Community clearly is not structured hierarchically, although I was prone to think of Lugari as a leader. He consistently and vigorously debated that label, talked about their decision-making process through conversation, the egalitarianism in a variety of ways. That shows up also in the built environment. All the homes are equally humble. Lugari lives in a home just like everybody else, which is not always true in intentional communities. The built environment brings people together as equals. There's nothing in Gaviotas that looks like this room. And it never happens that there's a speaker standing in front of an audience with a microphone holding forth for an hour and you're listening. That's not part of the structure of Gaviotas. His use of metaphor also conveyed to me this same sense of anti-structure. It's not a village, it's not a community, it's an organism, or it's an ecosystem. And he continually referred to a Gaviotas way of thinking, which he claimed was distinctive. And in particular, it was different from what he preferred to label as a Cartesian way of thinking. Gaviotas' way of thinking was not linear. It was not analytical in the sense of taking a whole and breaking it down into its parts. If you've ever read Descartes' Discourse on Method, he lays this out very clearly. To gain knowledge, you take a whole, and the whole is too hard to understand, and you break it down into each of its parts, and you analyze each of those parts. Lugari said, no, that's not helpful. We need to look for relationships. We need to look at connections. And that's what he meant by a non-Cartesian way of thinking, a Gaviotas way of thinking. So what does anti-structure do for society, did Victor Turner say? He called it a generative center, capable of reordering models of reality, redefining people's relationship to society, to nature, to culture, capable of initiating and innovating, outside-the-box thinking. And when I read these things in Victor Turner, it just seemed to me that they applied so well to what I saw in Gaviotas. Reordering models of reality, trying to do things a little differently, redefining people's relationship to nature and society and culture. All kinds of innovation, out-of-the-box thinking. So my suspicion is that somehow there might be a lot of anti-structure at MUN too. On the other hand, Lugari's explanation for what Gaviotas has achieved is simpler. He said all it took was some dreaming. And then he said his famous line, if you aren't dreaming, you must be asleep. Gaviotas is recognized nationally within Colombia and internationally for its innovations. It did make it onto a Colombian postage stamp. My final question at the end of our many hours of conversation, final question for him was, what happens to Gaviotas when Paolo Lugari is no longer here? I was a little reluctant to put it that way, but he didn't bat an eye. And his answer was, everyone asks that. But we are an organism, collectivity. Gaviotas does not depend on any one person, including me. Gracias por su visita. And I'd like to hear any questions, and especially hear your assessment of Paolo Lugari and the efforts at Gaviotas. Thanks a lot.
Even though he doesn't call himself a leader, he would probably agree with the concept of facilitator, don't you think?
He certainly didn't use that word. It's not how he described the procedure. I would certainly agree with you. I'm not sure if he would admit to it. I'm also not entirely sure that he correctly assesses his own role. I wasn't in a position to observe meetings and see how things went. He claims that he is just one voice. He said, I've never called a meeting, I've never written an internal memo. I participate in the conversations. So we can choose to be skeptical of that or take him at his word. Yes?
But you did say you love to talk, so you spend hours and hours listening.
Yeah.
So I don't know, does that suddenly stop when he's in a meeting? I don't know.
Right, could that be relevant? When he talked about the oh, sorry, yes, the lady said, but I said he likes to talk, and maybe that's an indicator that he's more than an ordinary participant in the conversation. I made a kind of similar point. I said, well, it might be that the conversations are open, but in my experience, including experience in intentional communities, there are always people who tend to dominate the conversation. I asked him, or I said that to him, and he said, well, that may be, but it doesn't mean their ideas dominate. And I thought that was a pretty good answer. He said, somebody may say 50 words and somebody else puts in one word, and that one word sends things in a new direction. So that was his response. Go ahead.
I have two other questions. One is, were you able to speak to anybody else there?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
And did they seem to say the same things that he was saying, or did they have different perspectives?
I didn't hear anything that contradicted what he said. Sorry, I'll have to get into that habit. The question was, did I talk to other people in the community? And the answer was yes. And I didn't hear anything that contradicted anything Lugari said. Wherever we went, he would turn over the description of the process, say the tapping of the pine trees or the making of the rosin in the factory. He would turn that over to another member, and they would give most of the explanation for it, because he viewed them as sort of the special expert, at least for the time being, in that area. Okay. Yeah. Yes, you.
What happens if a member of the 200 people, their children or someone becomes disruptive or mentally ill? Like here in the United States, children are getting 54 vaccines by the time they're 6 years old, and there's 25% of the kids are on psychiatric drugs. So has their health in terms of, are they buying into that kind of conventional wisdom?
Okay, the question is, what about members who don't go along, who are disruptive, who cause problems? What about the children that maybe in our society get drugs if they're disruptive, or things like that? And does Gaviotas buy into the major medical model of psychiatric health, psychological health? I don't know enough to answer that question, I'm afraid. I asked him what happens excuse me, if someone doesn't pull their share of the work, for example. And he said that the social pressure is so great that they'll kind of be forced out. People will just not make it known that they're not pulling their weight and they're not really valued as a resident. And at least he told me, I of course didn't see this happen, but he told me that such people generally leave. They realize that it's not a very good fit for them. But that's the limit of my understanding. And as far as children, I didn't ask about that.
So this is going back to the earlier slide about the wealth pyramid. And I'll preface this by saying I'm playing devil's advocate. This is not my opinion. I was speaking with an economist who said that the pyramid has always looked like that throughout history, so therefore saying it's getting worse doesn't really mean anything. So if the wealthiest have always been the smallest proportion of society, what does it really mean that we gauge our social sustainability by looking at that?
The question has to do with that economic pyramid that I showed at the beginning of the talk, and someone that said human society has always been that way, and therefore do we really need to worry about it if that's kind of a constant in the human condition. I happen to know that Avi was an anthropology major in college because he went to the college where I teach, and I happen to know that he knows better than the person who asked him that question or who made that comment. It is not, in fact, true that humans have always had a wealth pyramid, something like that, because the first phase of human existence on Earth, which covered, oh boy, I'll somewhat make this number up, let me just say 75% of human history on Earth, we lived in small egalitarian societies in which there was no measure of wealth. Consequently, there was no significant measure of wealth, and there would not be ways of discriminating wealth. Wealth differences really begin with the evolution of the state as a social phenomenon, political phenomenon, and get exacerbated with the invention of money. Because money has that funny property that you can't have too much of it. If your measure of wealth is potatoes, you can have too many potatoes. You can't eat them, they'll rot. If you don't spend the dollars, they'll be fine, and you can save them for next year. So that would be my answer to that. I would just challenge the premise.
So we go to a little more detail then. If you're looking at a feudal system in the Middle Ages, the king proportionately will have as much as the top 1% we have today compared to the peasants. And so from that state level on, has it actually gotten any worse or different other than there just happens to be more people overall?
I think the question is whether at the state level has it gotten any worse. My inclination is to refer back to the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I, maybe I didn't explain it before, sorry. The Gini coefficient is a measure of wealth distribution in a society. And high Gini coefficient means it's distributed evenly, and a low one unevenly, or the reverse. Does anybody happen to know? You can look at different societies around the world and see strikingly different Gini coefficients. So I would say that even that isn't true. It's not true that it's always a really skewed distribution of wealth. Scandinavian countries, for example, have much more equitable distribution of wealth than the U.S. And the U.S. is more equitable than Mexico, say. Okay, yes, sir.
Gaviotas, you said some of the people have been there for 30 years. What do they do if they're disabled or the elderly who can't work? How do they take care of them?
Good question. Some of the people have been there for a long time. What happens if they become disabled or too old to really do productive work? I think the answer to that is, the basic answer is that the community takes care of them. They stay there, they live there, the community takes care of them. The more nuanced answer is probably very few people who can't do any work at all, and the community will find work for them to do. Yeah. Yep.
What was he doing before this? What prompted this? What did he do before this happened?
Question is, what was Paolo Lugari doing before Gaviotas? Good question. He went to college. Well, he grew up in Popayan, right. And he took some courses at college but didn't finish. He then got a grant, I think maybe from the UN, to go to the Philippines and study economic development there. And what he saw there was the conventional kind of economic development, and he didn't like it much. And he came back to Colombia and began thinking about alternatives. He says, he's quoted by Alan Weissman in the book as saying that he grew up, his father and some of his other close relatives were somewhat prominent people in Colombian society, and he grew up hearing dinner table conversations about the world's problems and what needed to be done to fix them. So he was kind of predisposed to be a thinker and hopefully a doer. When he came back from his time in the Philippines, he went to work for the government in their economic development program. And then kind of by chance, he accepted an invitation from his uncle, who was minister of something, I can't remember, maybe minister of public works, to take a tour, an aerial tour of different parts of Colombia with him. And one of the parts they visited was the Llanos. And on his first visit there, he thought, oh, it was the most horrible place in the world he'd ever seen. It was so barren and so impoverished. And on the second visit there, he began to think, gee, it's actually kind of beautiful in its own way. And on his third visit there, he fell in love with it and decided that he needed to find some way to come back to the Llanos. And so for the next several years, he shuttled back and forth between his job and the Llanos, exploring it with friends and associates, until he finally, they all kind of came up with the idea of starting this community there. Yeah, so, yeah.
Short question. You said it's a pretty stable population, around 200. Many have been there a long time. Is there a turnover, or is it pretty much the same people in their field?
There's been some turn. The question is the population stable, or has there been turnover? There's been some. Yes, it's been stable on average. There has been some turnover, but the words he used were, most of the people here have been here for more than 30 years. Again, I couldn't independently
So following up on
confirm that. Yeah.
Have there been other attempts to create something similar? Also, how much land do they have to?
Okay, have there been similar attempts to create something similar, and how much land do they have? Oh, I should remember the number on the total number of hectares. It seems to me that it's about 12,000 hectares, maybe.
200 people, that's pretty big.
Yeah, it's a lot of land. Of course, 8,000 hectares is in the Caribbean pine, so that's a big chunk of it. I asked him how many people they could support at Gaviotas, which is related, I think, to your question. And he said, well, we feel that we could probably handle 1,000, and more than that, we might begin to generate more waste than could conveniently be absorbed. The sink capacity would be exceeded. In answer to the question of other communities like it, yes, there are a couple of other, I don't mean this disparagingly at all, copycat communities in the Llanos that other people are starting. Gunter Pauli is the name of one person, he's German, I believe, who came and lived in Gaviotas for a while and then decided he'd like to replicate it and take the model and go elsewhere and do something similar. I haven't visited the community and I'm not really too sure how they're doing. I asked Paolo directly about replicating Gaviotas, and his answer was interesting. He said it can't be copied. It's unique, and every such experiment is unique. So he said what we can do is not provide a blueprint, but provide inspiration. That's what he saw as Gaviotas' main role, to inspire people to think along similar lines, but come up with a solution that's right for where they are.
I have a hard time getting my head around the idea you can run a effective business that provides healthy salaries without having roles and functions that are defined.
Sorry, without having what?
Roles, particular functions, or in other words, structure.
There is a kind of role situation there. I maybe overplayed that card a little bit. There is somebody who is temporarily, at least, in charge of the pine plantation. There's somebody who's in charge of the factory facility for manufacturing the photovoltaic cells. There's somebody temporarily in charge of the gardens. But they tend to rotate around, and people don't get locked into just one place. So there is a little bit of structure, but in comparison to the typical business, less, seemed to me. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the very enjoyable recap of what I had read this book from before.
Oh, you've read it? Great.
10, 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I think there are businesses in this town that are run without that hierarchical structure.
We visited with the gentleman who runs the Sky Company.
Right.
That's one example.
And I think Gore-Tex is like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And but why is this community doesn't grow elsewhere? It seems to me part of the reason is that it's fairly unrestricted by government. You said that one thing about what operation they could have. I forget. I didn't catch what it was, but
the hospital.
Yeah, and because when you introduced Adam Smith, you introduced him as if Adam Smith has been dominating our culture, our political culture since he wrote, and obviously it hasn't, because he was basically